This is Frankenstein, the abridged version, but it's going to cover chapters 2 through 4 of the unabridged. But it's just going to cover it in a lot less time, with a lot less words, and a lot easier to understand language. Elizabeth loved Switzerland. She loved the mountains and the lakes. She was always interested in art and beauty. I was different. While Elizabeth would get excited about how beautiful things were, I always wanted to know what made them the way they were. Even as a child, I was becoming a man of science. When I was 7 years old, my brother Ernest was born. At that time, my parents stopped traveling to different countries. We had a house in the city of Geneva. We also had a place in the country on the shore of a lake. We spent most of our time in the country house. It was there 4 years later that my brother William was born. Our family did not know a lot of people, and I had only one close friend. His name was Henry, and he was the son of a Geneva businessman. Henry and I became best friends. He used to dream of the days of King Arthur. He always was making up plays about knights and fair ladies. He always wanted Elizabeth and me to act out these plays. Henry, Elizabeth, and I spent our childhoods together. We were like 3 parts of one person. Elizabeth was the soul, Henry was the heart, and I was the mind. Henry kept telling stories of heroes and great adventures. Elizabeth had her art, and I began to study science. You must understand that I was quite young. I knew little about science. I read any books that I thought might explain the wonders of science. I found a number of these books in my father's library. They were by men who lived a long time ago. One day, my father found me reading one of these books. "Ah, you're reading this?" my father said. "My dear Victor, don't waste your time on this. It is sad garbage." If my father had explained to me that no one believed in these books anymore, it would have been different. Most of the stuff in these books was little more than black magic. Science had already shown that these writers were silly. But I didn't know this. I was angry. My father thought that the books I liked were garbage. Instead of stopping reading these books, I found more like them. Looking back on it, I guess I was foolish. I tried spells to change lead into gold. I tried to make devils appear. Of course, none of these spells worked. I might have gone on this way for years, but then something happened. One night when I was 15 years old, we were at our country house. A terrible storm came up. As I watched from my window, I saw lightning hit an oak tree. When the storm was over, I went out and looked at what was left of the tree. I thought that I would just find a burned tree, but the tree had turned into small pieces of wood by the lightning. I was surprised. Why did this happen? A friend of my father's was visiting us that day. He was a scientist. He explained how lightning had destroyed the tree. Before this day, I didn't know much about electricity. This was the true beginning of my life as a scientist. Forgot all about those silly books that were filled with magic spells. I began to study nature and to read books about true science. I felt as if the lightning had been a sign from heaven. It had pointed the way my life would go. What I didn't know was that this sign could not have been from heaven. I didn't know that my study of science would someday destroy my life and all that I loved. When I was 17 years old, my parents decided that I should go away to a university in Germany. I was ready to leave when Elizabeth got sick. It was scarlet fever. My mother took care of her. Elizabeth got better, but my mother caught scarlet fever. She knew she was dying. She called Elizabeth and me to her bedside. "I have always wanted you 2 children to marry one day," she told us. "Now that day is close. I am so sad that I must leave you. but I hope we will meet again in another world. She died quietly. We were all very sad. It didn't seem right for me to go off to the university right away. I stayed at home for a few more weeks. I spent most days with Elizabeth. Finally, the time came for me to leave. My friend Henry came over that last day. I knew that everything in my life was about to change. Maybe that's why Elizabeth, Henry, and I spent this last day together. We had never been closer or loved each other more. Little did I know that we would never share such happiness again. The next morning, I left for the university. After a long, hard trip, I arrived in Germany. The next day, I went to the university and met my teachers. The first one I saw was Dr. Crump. He taught science. He knew a lot about science, but he was a rude man. He asked me what science books I had read. I told him about the books with magic spells. He laughed out loud. What a waste of time, he said. Nobody bothers with those books anymore. You'll have to start your studies all over again. He gave me a list of books to buy. He told me about another teacher, Dr. Waldman. Dr. Waldman taught chemistry. I took Dr. Crump's book lists, but I wasn't planning to go to his classes. His rude ways put me off too much. About a week later, I stopped by the lecture hall to see what Dr. Waldman looked like. I was happily surprised. I was happily surprised to see what Dr. Waldman looked like. I was happily surprised. Waldman was everything Crump was not. He spoke well with a very pleasant voice. Where Crump was hard, Waldman was smooth. And that man could teach. He started off with a history of chemistry. The old masters promised things they couldn't do. Turn lead into gold. Stay young forever. These were all empty dreams. But scientists of today are different. They don't promise much, but look at what they have done. We now know how blood moves through our bodies. We know what makes up the air we breathe. We are aiming at the skies, and we get closer every day. Who knows what wonders may come next? How Waldman's words excited me. I could hardly sleep that night. I went to him the next morning. I told him the same things I had told Crump, but Waldman didn't laugh at the books I had read. He said, we owe a lot to those old writers. True, they were wrong, but don't you see? They started it all. Without them, science wouldn't be what it is today. Waldman told me that he was happy I wanted to study chemistry with him. However, you should study all kinds of science, not just chemistry, he said. Studying just one kind of science is like studying only one side of a building. All you know is that one side. He took me to his workshop. He showed me how his machines worked. Then he gave me a long list of books to read. When I left Dr. Waldman's house, my life was changed. I spent the next 2 years studying science. I didn't even go home for a visit. I lived for my books and classes. I made some discoveries in chemistry that made me well known at the university. Finally, the time had come to begin work on my own. But what would that work be? I thought of going home to Geneva. I wanted to visit my family and friends. But then something happened that made me stay where I was. The wonder of life had always interested me, not just in humans, but in animals as well. Just where did life come from? No one had ever known. Most of my studies had been in chemistry. Now I decided to study human biology. To study life is also to study death. I wanted to see how death changed bodies. I cut into dead animals and people. I saw how death gives way to life. A human or animal dies, and its body gives food and life to worms. I know that cutting up dead bodies sounds horrible, but it didn't seem that way to me. Then, like a flash of light, it came to me. It was so simple. Why hadn't anyone seen it before? I knew that I had come upon the secret of life. I knew that I could make things come to life. I can see from your face that you would like to know this secret too, but that cannot be. I cannot tell. If you hear my story to its end, you will see why. I tell you this, be happy that you do not know this secret. It's much better not to know. When I found I could really create life, I had to stop to think. Should I start with simple animals? And if so, what ones? At first, I didn't think that I should try to make an animal like myself, a man. It would be too hard. But then I thought about how things were changing in science all the time. New discoveries were being made every day. I was sure that if I had problems, I would find answers. I had to succeed. I knew I would. For a month, I gathered my things together. Then I began. What was I thinking at this time, you may ask? Was I like a man who had lost his mind? No, my friend, far from it. I was going to create a new kind of man. This man would love me more than a son loves his father. I also thought if I could make lifeless parts live, maybe I could bring the dead back to life. These thoughts kept me going. I shake when I think of the things I did. I robbed graves and cut up the dead bodies. I can still see all those staring dead eyes. I stole bones and organs. The horror of it stays with me even today. My work became everything to me. I didn't write to my family, and I never went out with friends. I ate very little and began to lose weight. My eyes grew deep set in my face. Most of the time I didn't wash. I worked in a secret room at the top of my house near the university. At times, what I was doing made me sick, but still, I kept working.